The Third Fleet died at 1400 hours, Galactic Standard. I watched it happen from the tactical bridge of the Concorde flagship Absolute Authority, standing behind a holographic display that showed 700 warships dissolving into nothing. The Velhari Third Fleet, my people. Ships I had helped design, crewed by officers I had trained, armed with weapons I had certified as sufficient for any known threat in the galaxy. They lasted 6 hours against the Vreth swarm, before the last distress signal cut to static, and then there was only silence, and the soft hum of the display cycling through contact markers that no longer existed. I am Commander Kale Drennick, Senior Military Strategist for the Galactic Concorde's Peacekeeping Council, and on that day I learned something that changed everything I thought I knew about warfare, survival, and the species we had locked away 4 centuries ago. I had spent 30 years studying galactic conflict. I had written doctrine manuals used by every member species. I had personally designed the defensive formations that the Third Fleet had deployed before it died, and now I stood on the bridge of the most powerful ship in the Concorde Navy, and understood, with a clarity that burned like acid in my chest, that none of it mattered. Everything I had built, everything I had studied, every strategy I had certified as viable, it was all useless against an enemy that treated our best weapons like food. The Vreth had appeared without warning 18 months earlier, pouring through a rift at the galaxy's edge like a wound, bleeding darkness into clean water. They were not a fleet. They were not an army. They were a swarm, a living tide of biomechanical organisms that consumed everything in their path and used the raw material to grow larger. Every ship they destroyed became part of them. Every station they devoured fed their expansion. The more we fought, the stronger they became, and no one on the council had the courage to say out loud what the mathematics had been screaming for months. We were losing, not slowly, not gradually. We were falling off a cliff, and the ground was rushing up to meet us. I pulled the fleet projections on my personal terminal as the last of the Third Fleet's signals faded. The numbers were simple and brutal. At the current rate of expansion, the Vreth would consume every inhabited system in the Concorde within 14 months. Every conventional strategy our best minds had modeled ended the same way: defeat, extinction, silence. The emergency session was called within the hour. I walked into the grand chamber of the Concorde Council and found 12 species representatives already seated, and not one of them could meet another's eyes. The Dromon ambassador's 4 hands were trembling. The Silkari delegation sat in perfect stillness, which for their species meant absolute terror. Admiral Torin, my direct superior, and the highest-ranking Velhari military officer in the Concorde, stood at the central podium, with a face carved from stone, reading casualty figures that no one wanted to hear, but everyone needed to. 3 full battle fleets destroyed, 47 colony systems consumed, 18 billion civilian casualties across 9 species, and the swarm was accelerating. The debate that followed was frantic and useless. The Dromon wanted to consolidate all remaining forces around their homeworld. The Silkari proposed a diplomatic mission to the Vreth, which would have been admirable if the Vreth had ever responded to any form of communication with anything other than consumption. The Kelzari suggested a superweapon program that would take 30 years to develop. We had 14 months. Then a junior Dromon analyst named Dalen, barely old enough to hold his rank, raised his hand and said something that made the entire chamber go silent. He said, "What about the Terrans?" I watched the reaction ripple through the room like a shockwave. Representatives who had been shouting over each other went quiet. Ambassador Vorethi, the oldest Silkari in the chamber, and possibly the oldest living being in the Concorde, closed all 4 of her eyes simultaneously. Admiral Torin's jaw tightened, and for a long, terrible moment, nobody spoke. I knew about the Terran Exclusion Accord, of course. Every military strategist studied it in their first year of training. 400 years ago, the Galactic Concorde had permanently banned the Terran species from participating in any form of interstellar warfare. The official language in the Accord was deliberately vague, referencing the preservation of galactic stability and the maintenance of proportional force doctrines. Most of us assumed it meant the Terrans were too primitive, too emotionally volatile, too unpredictable to be trusted with fleet-scale combat. A species that had spent most of its history fighting itself could hardly be trusted to fight alongside others. But when I accessed the historical record on my terminal, Searching for the actual details behind the ban, I found almost nothing. The accord itself, a list of signatories, and a single classified footnote referencing something called the Harkin Incident, sealed by unanimous council vote with no expiration date. I requested immediate declassification. Admiral Torrens supported the motion. The vote split the chamber down the middle until WhyHFY spoke for the first time. She was ancient, her scaled skin pale with age, her voice like dry leaves dragged across stone. She said only this: "You do not understand what you are asking to release. It is not a weapon you can aim and then put away. It is a fire, and once it burns, you will not control where it spreads." The chamber erupted. Voices overlapped. Species that hadn't agreed on anything in decades found common ground in their desperation, and when the vote was finally called, desperation won by a margin of 2. The Harkin files would be unsealed, and a formal request would be transmitted to Earth, asking the Terran species to contribute military forces to the defense of the galaxy. I was appointed as the liaison. My qualifications were straightforward. I was the Concord's leading expert in cross-species military doctrine. I spoke passable Terran standard, and I was expendable enough that no one important would be lost if the mission went wrong. I accepted without hesitation. At that point, I still believed this was a diplomatic formality. The Terrans were a mid-tier civilization on a single world. How much could they really offer? Before I departed, WhyHFY found me in the corridor outside the chamber. She moved slowly, leaning on a walking staff that was older than most civilizations, and she gripped my arm with surprising strength. Her eyes, all 4 of them, locked onto mine with an intensity that made my skin crawl. "The ban was never about protecting the galaxy from Terrans in war," she said. "It was about protecting the galaxy from what Terrans become during war. You will understand when you arrive, and when you do, remember that I warned you." I thanked her for her concern, and dismissed it as the melodrama of an old mind clinging to ancient fears. That was a mistake I would never make again. The journey to Earth took 9 days at maximum transit speed. I spent the time reviewing every scrap of unclassified information about Terran civilization. Population of 11 billion, concentrated on a single world, with minor colonial outposts in their home system. A robust economy. Advanced technology, though nothing that appeared to surpass Concord standards. A reputation for stubbornness and emotional intensity that most species found exhausting. Nothing remarkable. Nothing frightening. When I arrived in orbit, I expected a modest world. What I found instead made me pause at the viewport for a long time. Earth was beautiful. Vibrant blue oceans, sprawling green continents, swirling white clouds. But the orbital infrastructure was extraordinary. Thousands of stations, shipyards, communication arrays, and research platforms formed a dense lattice around the planet, all of it civilian, all of it radiating energy signatures that suggested technology generations ahead of what the Concorde had on record. These people had spent 4 centuries with no military outlet, and they had poured every drop of their aggressive innovation into building something I could barely comprehend. I was shuttled to the surface and escorted to a military facility buried deep beneath a mountain range on the northern continent. The facility was accessed through a series of blast doors, each one thicker than the last, descending underground for what my instruments told me was nearly 2 kilometers. The corridors were clean, well lit, and maintained to a standard that suggested daily use, not centuries of dormancy. Everything was active, everything was ready, as if they had been waiting. At the bottom, in a conference room carved from solid rock, I met Fleet Marshal Lena Okoye. She was not what I expected. A small woman by Terran standards, lean and precise in her movements, with close-cropped gray hair and eyes that reminded me of gun barrels. She shook my hand with a grip that was firm but not aggressive, offered me something called coffee, and sat across from me with the patience of someone who had been expecting this conversation for a very long time. There was no surprise on her face, no alarm, no urgency. She sat with the calm stillness of a surgeon preparing for an operation she had rehearsed 1,000 times. Around her, the facility hummed with quiet activity. Officers moved through corridors with purposeful efficiency, carrying data tablets and equipment cases, none of them rushing, none of them idle. Everything moved at a pace that suggested not haste but readiness, the comfortable tempo of people who had been prepared for this moment for longer than I had been alive. I delivered the Concorde's formal request. I explained the Vreth threat, the fleet losses, the projected timeline for galactic collapse. I presented the Council's offer of partnership, full integration into the Concorde command structure, shared resources, mutual defense obligations. She listened to all of it without interrupting. When I finished, she smiled. Not a warm smile, not a cruel one, something in between, something that had been waiting. "We have been ready since before your grandfather's species evolved," she said. "Show me the tactical data. All of it." I transferred everything. Fleet compositions, engagement records, Vreth biological analyses, strategic projections. She reviewed it in minutes, scrolling through data that had taken our best analysts months to compile, and I saw her expression shift only once, a brief tightening around the eyes when she reached the civilian casualty figures. "I will need to show you something," she said. "Follow me." She led me through another series of corridors, deeper still, until we emerged onto a viewing platform overlooking an underground cavern so vast that I could not see the far wall. The cavern was filled with ships, Terran warships, hundreds of them, locked in maintenance cradles and glowing with dormant power systems that pulsed like sleeping heartbeats. They were nothing like Concorde vessels, where our ships were elegant and symmetrical, designed as much for diplomatic presence as for combat. These were brutal, angular, dense with armor plating and weapon systems that bristled from every surface, like the spines of a threatened animal. They radiated energy signatures my instruments could not classify, readings that suggested power generation methods the Concorde had never encountered. I pointed to the nearest vessel, a relatively small ship compared to the others, and asked what class it was. "That is a patrol corvette," Okoye said. I checked my readings again. The corvette was larger than my species' heavy cruisers. Its weapons loadout exceeded anything I had ever seen on a single vessel. And it was, according to Okoye, the smallest combat-rated ship in their inventory. My mouth went dry. I turned slowly, looking out across the cavern, counting cradles, estimating rows, calculating depth. The facility stretched for hundreds of kilometers in every direction. There were thousands of ships down here, tens of thousands, built, maintained, and upgraded over 4 centuries of enforced peace by a species that had never once believed that peace would last. I looked at Okoye and saw no pride in her face, no excitement, only the steady, patient readiness of someone who had spent her entire career preparing for a day she hoped would never come, but always knew would. "How many?" I asked, and my voice sounded very small in that enormous space. She told me the number. I will not repeat it here, because even now, years later, it frightens me to say it out loud. The galaxy had locked the Terrans away for 400 years and assumed they were sitting quietly in the dark. They were not sitting quietly. They were building, and the thing they had built was beyond anything the Concorde had ever imagined possible from a single species on a single world. I stood on that platform and felt something I had never felt before in my military career. I felt afraid, not of the Vreth, but of the allies I had just invited into the war. The Harkin incident files arrived on my personal terminal at 0300 hours, transmitted directly from the Concorde's sealed archives. I read them in my quarters aboard the Terran facility, sitting on a bed that was slightly too short for my frame, surrounded by the low hum of machinery that never stopped running. The files were extensive: recovered combat logs, after-action reports, intelligence assessments, and testimony from survivors of 12 different species. It took me 4 hours to read everything, and by the time I finished, my hands were shaking. 400 years ago, the Galactic Concorde had been engaged in a border conflict with the HFY Dominion, an aggressive reptilian species that controlled a modest territory along the galaxy's outer arm. The conflict was typical of its era: limited engagements over disputed systems, carefully managed escalation, diplomatic channels kept open throughout. The Concorde was winning slowly, and everyone expected a negotiated settlement within a decade. Then the HFY changed tactics. Without warning, They launched a massive assault on a joint colony world called Harkon's Landing, a mixed settlement that included Velhari, Dromon, Silkari, and approximately 30,000 Terran civilians. The HFY fleet arrived in overwhelming numbers and began a systematic orbital bombardment that lasted 11 hours. When it was over, the colony was ash. Over 200,000 civilians across all species were dead. Among them were 28,000 Terrans, including 6,000 children. The Concord response was predictable: emergency sessions, diplomatic protests, the authorization of a larger counteroffensive. But the Terrans responded differently. Within 72 hours of the Harkon massacre, a Terran volunteer fleet arrived at the front lines and requested permission to participate in the counteroffensive. The Concord, grateful for any additional forces, granted immediate authorization. They expected perhaps 50 to 100 ships, a supplementary force to bolster the main fleet. 340 warships dropped out of transit and formed up in perfect combat formation. They carried weapons the Concord had never seen, deployed tactics no other species had conceived, and were crewed by men and women whose faces showed something that every alien observer described the same way. Not anger, not grief, something colder, something focused, purpose distilled to its most lethal concentration. A Concord observer embedded with the Terran fleet at the time wrote in his personal log that looking into the eyes of a Terran bridge officer during the approach to HFY space was like looking into the eyes of something that had already decided you were dead and was now simply processing the logistics. The observer, a Dromon diplomat named Tesh Voralis, spent 3 weeks aboard a Terran cruiser and reported that the crew never raised their voices, never argued, never showed any sign of internal discord. They moved through their duties with a synchronization that went beyond training. It was, Voralis wrote, as if the massacre at Harkon had burned away every part of them that was not directly useful for the task ahead. The counteroffensive began as a conventional military campaign. Concord forces advanced along the border, retaking disputed systems through superior numbers and firepower. The Terrans were assigned to the secondary front, expected to hold defensive positions while the main fleet pressed forward. They did not hold defensive positions. Within the first week, the Terran fleet had pushed past the border and deep into HFY territory, moving faster than any force the Concord had ever fielded. They did not attack military targets in the traditional sense. They attacked everything that made the HFY military possible. Supply lines were severed, communication networks were disrupted, fuel reserves were identified and destroyed with surgical precision. Shipyard infrastructure was dismantled piece by piece, starting with the manufacturing facilities that produced replacement components. Agricultural stations that fed HFY military populations were targeted and neutralized without harming civilian food supplies, a distinction so precise it required intelligence capabilities the Concord did not know the Terrans possessed. The HFY fleet, suddenly cut off from resupply and unable to coordinate, began to fragment. Individual task forces attempted to regroup and counterattack, but the Terrans had anticipated every retreat pattern, every fallback position, every contingency plan. When the HFY High Command ordered their fleet to retreat to their homeworld for a final defensive stand, they arrived to find Terran ships already waiting in orbit. The Terrans had predicted the retreat before it was ordered, and had positioned forces along every possible approach route. The HFY fleet found itself surrounded not by a wall of ships, but by a web of strategic positions so perfectly calculated that any attempt to fight or flee led directly into another kill zone. The military campaign lasted 43 days. The HFY Dominion's entire war-making capability was destroyed in less than 2 months. But what shook the Concord to its core was not the speed or the efficiency of the Terran campaign. It was what came after. The Terrans had been intercepting HFY communications from the first day of the war. Every tactical transmission, every classified briefing, every private communication between military leaders and their government. They compiled this intelligence into a comprehensive picture of HFY society, and then, methodically, they weaponized it. Terran broadcast ships entered HFY space and began transmitting captured communications directly to the HFY civilian population. Military reports showing the true state of the war that contradicted government propaganda. Classified orders revealing that the Harkon attack had been motivated not by strategic necessity, but by a political faction's desire to provoke a conflict that would justify increased military spending. Internal memoranda showing corruption, incompetence, and deliberate deception at every level of HFY leadership. The effect was devastating. HFY society, which depended on strict hierarchical trust between citizens and their leadership, collapsed from the inside. Not physically, psychologically. Public trust in every institution evaporated within weeks. Military officers refused orders because they no longer believed their commanders were acting in good faith. Citizens who had supported the war effort discovered that the conflict they had been told was necessary for survival was actually a manufactured crisis designed to benefit a political faction. The HFY people did not rebel. They simply stopped participating. Factories slowed. Recruitment dropped to zero. Entire military units disbanded themselves, not out of cowardice, but out of a fundamental loss of belief that there was anything worth fighting for. The Terrans did not commit genocide. They did not massacre civilians. They did not occupy HFY worlds or impose puppet governments. They did something the galaxy considered far worse. They made an entire species stop believing in itself. Within a generation, the HFY dominion was a hollow shell. Their military was disbanded, their government restructured multiple times, as faction after faction rose and fell in rapid succession. Their cultural identity fractured beyond recognition. They became a client state of the Concord, dependent and diminished, not because they lacked the resources to rebuild, but because they lacked the will. The Terrans had not destroyed the HFY. They had broken something inside them that could not be repaired. I closed the files and sat in silence for a long time. Then I went to find Lena Okoye. She was in the command center, reviewing fleet readiness reports with her staff. When she saw my face, she dismissed the room and sat down across from me. She already knew what I had read. "How could you do that?" I said. "You did not just defeat them, you destroyed who they were." She did not flinch. She did not look away. She met my eyes with the steady, level gaze of someone who had heard this accusation before and had already made peace with the answer. "Commander Drennick," she said, "every species in this galaxy fights the same way. You fight to win the battle in front of you, and then you negotiate terms, and then you wait for the next war. You treat conflict like a natural cycle, like weather, something to endure and survive until it passes. Terrans do not think that way. We cannot afford to. We evolved on a world that tried to kill us every single day, and we survived not because we were stronger or faster than the things hunting us, but because when something threatened us, we did not stop until the threat could never come back. Ever. That is not cruelty. That is not malice. It is survival taken to its logical conclusion. We fight to end the thing that threatened us, permanently. That is the difference between us and every other species in this galaxy." I asked her if she regretted what happened to the HFY. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Every single day. And if the situation required it, I would do it again. That is the burden of being Terran." I did not know how to respond to that. I still do not. The following morning, the Terran fleet began to launch. I watched from the surface observation station as the first ships rose from the underground facility, their engines burning with a light that was almost white, so intense that it left afterimages burned into my retinas. They came in disciplined waves, squadron after squadron, each formation tighter and more precise than anything I had seen from Concord forces. But the underground facility was only the beginning. As the morning progressed, ships began rising from locations across the entire planet. From beneath the oceans, massive hulls breaching the surface and shedding seawater as they climbed toward orbit. From mountain ranges that split apart along hidden seams to reveal launch bays carved into the living rock. From orbital stations that had been running dark for centuries, suddenly powering up with energy signatures that lit up every sensor array in the system. The fleet was enormous, not just large. Enormous in a way that defied the assumptions every Concord intelligence analyst had made for 400 years. We had believed the Terrans were a single-world civilization with modest military capabilities, kept in check by a ban they had no choice but to accept. The truth was that they had accepted the ban voluntarily and used the centuries of enforced peace to build a military infrastructure that dwarfed any single species' contribution to the Concord combined forces. What shook me most was not the number of ships, it was the diversity. The Terran fleet contained vessel classes that had no equivalent in any Concord navy. Ships designed for electronic warfare, capable of disrupting enemy communications across entire star systems. Medical ships the size of destroyers, equipped with surgical suites and recovery wards, because the Terrans planned for casualties with the same precision they planned for victory. Logistics vessels that could fabricate replacement parts and ammunition from raw materials harvested in the field. Intelligence ships bristling with sensor arrays, so sensitive they could detect a whisper of electromagnetic radiation from light years away. The Terrans had not just built a fleet, they had built an entire self-sustaining war machine capable of operating independently for years without resupply. They had planned for a conflict that would take them far from home and keep them there for as long as necessary. I counted ships until I lost track. Then I asked Okoye for the official number, and she told me, and I understood why WhyHFY had tried to warn me. The Terran fleet linked up with the remnants of the Concord Navy, at a staging area near the Drellis system. The contrast was stark and uncomfortable. Concord ships, battered and depleted from months of failed engagements against the Vreth, floated in loose formation alongside Terran vessels that gleamed with readiness. Our crews were exhausted, demoralized, haunted by the faces of friends they had lost. The Terran crews moved with quiet, focused efficiency, running system checks and combat drills as if this were just another day. Admiral Torin attempted to integrate the Terran forces into the Concord command structure. It was the standard protocol for Allied operations, a unified chain of command with shared tactical authority. Okoye refused. Politely, professionally, but without any room for negotiation. "We will coordinate with your forces," she said during the joint briefing. "We will share intelligence, synchronize movements, and protect your ships whenever possible. But we will not place our fleet under Concord tactical command." Torin's face darkened. "We have protocols for joint operations, Marshal Okoye. Command unity is essential." Okoye did not raise her voice. She pulled up a holographic display showing the complete tactical record of every engagement the Concord had fought against the Vreth. 47 engagements, 47 defeats, hundreds of ships lost, millions of lives spent. Every strategy, every tactic, every clever maneuver had ended the same way: failure. "You have been fighting this enemy your way and dying," she said. "Now you will watch us fight it ours. When you see the results, you can decide whether our methods are worth adopting. Until then, stay close, stay alert, and do not get between us and the target." The silence in the briefing room lasted almost a full minute. Then Torin nodded. He had no choice. We all knew it. The mathematics left no room for pride. I stood at the back of the room, watching the faces of Concord officers as they processed what was happening. These were proud individuals from proud species, veterans of a military tradition spanning millennia, and they were ceding tactical authority to a species that had been formally classified as a security risk for 4 centuries. Some of them looked relieved. Most of them looked afraid. I understood their fear. I shared it. Because the Terrans were not behaving like allies arriving to help. They were behaving like something that had been kept in a cage for a very long time and had just felt the door swing open. The Vreth swarm occupied the Tyrell system like a disease occupying a body. It filled the space between the system's 4 planets, tendrils of biomechanical matter, stretching millions of kilometers in every direction, pulsing with a rhythm that sensors interpreted as communication. At the center of the mass, the last inhabited world in the system, Tyrell Prime, was visible only as a faint glow beneath layers of swarm tissue that were slowly descending toward the surface. 14 million civilians were still alive down there. They had maybe 30 hours before the swarm completed its descent and consumed everything. The combined fleet arrived at the system's edge, and the Concord ships immediately took defensive positions according to standard engagement doctrine. Formation Delta 7, a layered defensive screen designed to absorb an attacking force's momentum and create opportunities for flanking counterattacks. It was the best formation our tacticians had developed over centuries of interstellar warfare. It had failed every single time we had used it against the Vreth. The Terran fleet did something none of us expected. It split apart. 300 warships divided into dozens of smaller strike groups, each containing between 5 and 15 vessels, and they scattered in every direction, cutting all emissions as they went. Within minutes, they had vanished from our sensors entirely. No engine signatures, no communication signals, no energy readings of any kind. 300 warships simply ceased to exist on every instrument we had. Admiral Torin contacted me on a private channel. "Where are they?" he demanded. "What are the Terrans doing?" I did not know. I tried to reach Okoye on the coordination frequency we had established. Static. The Terrans had gone completely silent. For 3 hours, nothing happened. The Vreth swarm continued its slow descent toward Tyrell Prime. Concord ships held their positions, weapons hot, crews at battle stations, waiting for an attack that did not come. The tension was unbearable. I stood on the tactical bridge of the Absolute Authority and watched the sensor displays show nothing but the swarm and our own ships, and I felt the cold certainty growing in my chest that the Terrans had abandoned us, that they had taken one look at the swarm and decided that this was not their fight after all. Then the swarm started to go insane. It began with a tremor, a ripple of disrupted movement that spread through the swarm's outer layers like a stone dropped into still water. Then sections of the swarm began attacking other sections. Tendrils that had been coordinating smoothly for months turned on each other, tearing and consuming with mindless aggression. Communication pulses between swarm clusters stuttered, fragmented, and went dark. The swarm, which had acted as a perfectly unified organism in every previous engagement, was tearing itself apart from the inside. I did not understand what was happening until the tactical data caught up with reality. During those 3 silent hours, the Terran strike groups had infiltrated the swarm's outer membrane. Their ships had been coated in harvested Vreth biomatter, collected from previous engagements, and analyzed at a molecular level. The coating made them invisible to the swarm's detection systems, indistinguishable from the swarm's own tissue. The Terrans had flown into the body of a living enemy and hidden there like parasites. Once inside, they had identified the swarm's coordination architecture. The Vreth was not one organism, it was a network, millions of semi-autonomous organisms, linked by neural relay nodes, that transmitted commands from a central intelligence. The Terrans had mapped this network in 3 hours. Our scientists had been studying the Vreth for 18 months, and had not even confirmed that the relay nodes existed. In 3 hours, the Terrans had found them, categorized them, and developed a method to sever them. The strike groups hit the relay nodes simultaneously. Precision weapons, guided by targeting data so accurate it seemed impossible, struck at the exact points where the swarm's coordination depended on signal transmission. Each destroyed node created a dead zone, a region of the swarm that could no longer receive commands from the central intelligence. The organisms in these dead zones did not shut down. They panicked. They attacked everything around them, unable to distinguish between friendly and hostile tissue. The swarm's greatest strength, its unity, became its greatest vulnerability. The Terrans had turned the swarm against itself. The main Terran fleet reappeared, like ghosts materializing from darkness. They came in fast, weapons already firing, hitting the fragmented swarm at every point of maximum disruption, and they fought like nothing I had ever seen. Concord Doctrine emphasized formation discipline. Ships held position, maintained firing lanes, coordinated through a command hierarchy that ensured every action was approved and synchronized. It was orderly, controlled, and predictable. The Terrans fought like a fluid. Their ships moved independently, each captain making split-second decisions based on local conditions, reacting to changes in the battlefield faster than any command structure could process. There were no orders being given, no tactical approvals being requested. Each ship seemed to know instinctively where it needed to be and what it needed to do, as if the entire fleet shared a single tactical consciousness. I later learned that this was the result of a training doctrine so intensive and deeply ingrained that Terran captains could predict each other's decisions with near-perfect accuracy. They did not need orders because they had spent years training together until their tactical instincts were synchronized at a fundamental level. They moved like a pack of predators, each individual autonomous, but all pursuing the same kill with perfect coordination. I watched a pair of Terran frigates execute a maneuver that should have been impossible. One frigate cut its engines entirely and drifted into the path of an incoming swarm tendril, drawing the organism's attention like bait. The moment the tendril committed to the attack, the second frigate appeared from below and severed it with a concentrated beam weapon at precisely the joint where the tendril connected to the main swarm body. The timing was measured in fractions of a second. The two captains had not communicated during the maneuver. They had simply known what the other would do, because they had trained together until their tactical instincts were indistinguishable. Another group of Terran ships used the Concorde defensive line as a pivot point, swinging around behind the swarm's main body and attacking a relay node from an angle that the swarm's sensors could not track. The node exploded, and the swarm organisms in that sector began attacking each other with mindless ferocity. The Terrans did not pause to watch. They were already moving to the next target. A Terran destroyer took a direct hit from a swarm tendril that tore through its port armor. I expected the ship to pull back, to seek cover behind the defensive line. Instead, it accelerated directly toward the nearest relay node, engines burning at maximum output, trailing fire and debris. The crew broadcast a final message on an open channel, calm voices speaking, with an ease that chilled my blood. They said their names. They said goodbye. Then the destroyer struck the relay node at full speed and detonated its reactor. The explosion consumed both the ship and the relay node, and the entire left flank of the swarm went inert. Millions of organisms, suddenly disconnected, drifted motionless in space. The battle lasted 7 hours. When it was over, the Vreth swarm at Tyrell was destroyed. Every organism, dead or inert. The first decisive victory against the Vreth since the war began. Tyrell Prime was saved. 14 million civilians would live. The Concorde lost 31 ships. The Terrans lost 43. In the aftermath, I walked through the corridors of the Absolute Authority and felt the strange, heavy atmosphere of a victory that did not feel like one. Concorde crews were celebrating with tears in their eyes, embracing each other, speaking the names of fallen comrades with voices cracked by grief and relief. It was messy and human, in a way that transcended species. We had survived. We had won. The emotional dam broke, and everything we had been holding back for months came flooding out. On the Terran ships, there was no celebration. I transferred to Okoye's command vessel, the Resolute Conviction, expecting to find her reviewing the battle results. Instead, I found the entire crew already at work. Damage assessment teams were cataloging every piece of Vreth wreckage within recovery range. Weapons engineers were analyzing the effectiveness of each munition type against different swarm tissue densities. Tactical analysts were building models of how the swarm had adapted during the battle, identifying patterns in its response to the relay node attacks. The speed of their recovery was not natural. It was not even disciplined. It was something else entirely, something mechanical and relentless that operated on a level beyond willpower. I found a Terran pilot named Catherine Hale sitting alone in a maintenance bay, running diagnostics on her fighter's targeting systems. Her flight suit was still stained with the residue of hard maneuvering, and her eyes had the hollow, distant look of someone who had been in close combat for hours. She had lost her entire squadron, 8 pilots, people she had trained with, eaten with, lived beside for years, all gone. I asked her if she was all right. She looked at me with those hollow eyes and said, "Grief is for after. Right now there is work." It was not bravery. It was not denial. It was something I had no word for in any language I spoke. The Terrans had not suppressed their emotions. They had learned to schedule them. They carried their grief in a separate compartment, sealed away, to be opened only when the task was complete. It was the most efficient and the most terrifying psychological adaptation I had ever witnessed. Back on the command ship, Concorde leaders were holding a celebration that felt increasingly hollow as reports came in from the Terran fleet. The Terran forces had suffered significant losses and had not paused for even a moment of mourning. They were already preparing for the next engagement. I caught private conversations between Concorde admirals in the corridors outside the celebration. They spoke in hushed tones about what they had witnessed. Not the victory, the Terrans, the way they fought, the way they sacrificed, the way they recovered and moved forward as if loss were simply another variable in an equation they had already solved. And beneath the admiration and the gratitude, I heard fear. Raw, unconcealed fear. One admiral, a Kelzari named Sorith, pulled me aside and asked a question that I know was on everyone's mind. "What happens when the Vreth are gone?" he said. "What do we do with the Terrans then? How do we put them back in the cage?" I did not have an answer. but the question stayed with me like a splinter under the skin. 2 days after the battle, Okoye summoned me to her war room. She had intercepted Vreth communication patterns and analyzed them with decryption algorithms that no Concord system could match. The swarm was not attacking random systems. It was moving towards something specific, deep in the galactic core. A source point. A central structure from which all the swarm's commands originated. "A queen?" she said, pointing to a holographic projection of the galaxy with a single point of light pulsing at its center. "Kill the queen, and the swarm dies. All of it. Everywhere. At once." I asked about a system-by-system defense strategy, clearing the swarm from each occupied territory through sustained military pressure. She shook her head. "The swarm regenerates faster than you can kill it at the edges. For every cluster you destroy, 2 more grow from the biomass it has already consumed. Defense is a losing strategy. The only way to win is to go to the source." "The Concord has never mounted an offensive that deep into hostile territory," I said. "The core is uncharted. The swarm density will increase exponentially as we approach." Okoye looked at me with those gun-barrel eyes and said, "We have. Every war we have ever fought, we go for the heart. It is the only strategy that works. Cut off the head, and the body dies. Everything else is just bleeding slowly." She was right. I knew she was right. And I also knew that what she was proposing would cost more lives than any of us were prepared to count. The journey to the galactic core took 19 days at maximum fleet speed, and during that time, I did something that no Concord liaison had done before. I embedded with the Terran crews. I ate in their mess halls, walked their corridors, observed their training rotations, and slowly, reluctantly, began to understand the species that my civilization had locked away for 4 centuries. The first thing I noticed was their ships. Every Terran warship was named after a place where humans had suffered. I walked through a cruiser called the Somme, a battleship named Hiroshima, a carrier designated Pompeii. When I asked a young officer named Daniel Marsh why they named their ships after disasters, he looked at me as if the answer were obvious. "So we never forget what happens when we fail," he said. "Every time you step onto this ship, you step onto a reminder. We carry our dead with us. It keeps us sharp." The training was relentless. Even during transit, with no enemy in range, the crews ran combat simulations every 8 hours. Full-intensity drills that left pilots drenched in sweat and gunners with aching hands. I watched a boarding team practice close-quarters combat in a zero-gravity training module, and the violence of it made me flinch. These were not rehearsals. These were full-contact engagements, using blunted weapons that still left bruises and occasional broken bones. The Terrans trained at a level of intensity that any Concord commander would have classified as dangerous. When I raised this concern with Okoye, she smiled and said, "A training accident means someone made a mistake that would have killed them in combat. Better to learn that lesson with a broken rib than a hull breach." The second thing I noticed was the personal quarters. Every Terran ship was austere in its design. Functional corridors, minimal decoration, efficient use of space. But the individual quarters were different. Each one contained personal items, photographs of families and loved ones, handwritten letters sealed in waterproof cases, small tokens and keepsakes that ranged from children's drawings to worn paperback books. One Marine had a pressed flower in a transparent case mounted above her bunk. Another kept a pair of hand-knitted socks that she said her daughter had made. The Terrans were not cold. They were not emotionless killing machines. They were the most emotionally intense species I had ever encountered. Every one of them carried a weight of feeling so heavy that it would have crushed any Velhari I knew. But they had learned to forge their emotions into something useful. Fear became alertness. Grief became determination. Love became the reason to fight harder and smarter, because somewhere behind them was something worth coming home to. It was on the 12th day of transit that the Vreth swarm found us. I had been sitting in the mess hall with a group of Terran engineers when the alarms went off. What struck me was their reaction. They did not freeze. They did not panic. Their hands stopped moving. Their conversations stopped mid-sentence. And within 2 seconds, they were on their feet and running toward their duty stations, with a fluidity that suggested the transition from casual to combat-ready was as natural to them as breathing. One engineer, A young man named Marcus Wells had been in the middle of telling a joke. He stopped, put down his cup and said, "Hold that thought," as if he would be right back. He did come back, 4 hours later, covered in coolant fluid from a ruptured conduit he had repaired under fire. He finished the joke. Everyone laughed. Then they went back to work. A hunting cluster, smaller than the one we had destroyed at Tyrell, but still comprising millions of organisms, intercepted the fleet's transit corridor and attacked without warning. The Concorde ships scrambled into defensive formation. The Terrans responded in seconds, strike groups peeling away from the main fleet to engage the cluster's outer elements, while the core fleet maintained course and speed. But this engagement was different. The Vreth had adapted. The relay nodes were buried deeper within the swarm's body, shielded by layers of dense tissue that absorbed weapons fire. Tendril formations had changed, becoming thicker and more aggressive, capable of wrapping around Terran ships before they could break free. And the swarm was mimicking Terran communication frequencies, broadcasting false signals that caused momentary confusion in the fleet's coordination. For any other species, this adaptation would have been demoralizing. I watched the Terran bridge crew receive reports of the swarm's new capabilities, and their reaction was not despair. It was something close to satisfaction. Okoye studied the tactical data for 30 seconds, and then issued a series of orders that restructured the entire fleet's approach in real time. New weapons configurations, new formation patterns, countermeasures for the communication jamming that had been developed, tested, and deployed within 10 minutes of the problem being identified. An enemy that adapts is an enemy that is afraid, she told me, as the battle raged outside the viewport. Fear means it knows it can die. When it stops adapting, that is when you should worry, because it means it has decided to accept its fate. As long as it fights, it is still hoping to survive. And hope makes things predictable. She was not being philosophical. She was being tactical. In the time it took her to say those words, her weapons team had already developed a frequency-hopping communication protocol that made the Vreth jamming useless. Her armor division had identified the new tendril formation's structural weakness, a junction point where the thickened tissue met the thinner connecting strands, and had distributed targeting solutions to every ship in the fleet. Her science team was analyzing the new relay node shielding and designing a penetrating munition that could pierce the protective layers. All of this happened in the background while she spoke to me, as if the act of fighting a war and the act of having a conversation existed on parallel tracks that never interfered with each other. The hunting cluster was destroyed in 4 hours, but the losses were heavier this time. 11 Terran ships, over 2,000 crew members. 3 days later, a larger swarm element hit the fleet from a different angle. This time, the Vreth had developed grappling formations, dense nets of tissue that entangled ships and prevented the reactor detonation tactic that had been so effective at Tyrell. A Terran carrier group, 7 ships strong, was caught in one of these nets. The carrier's commander, Captain Sophie Brennan, realized within minutes that her ships could not break free. She ordered all non-essential crew to escape pods and then turned her carrier broadside into the swarm, using the ship's mass to physically tear a path through the net so that 3 destroyers behind her could reach the buried relay node. I listened to her final transmission. Her voice was steady, professional, almost conversational. She reported her ship's status, confirmed the destroyer's trajectory, and wished them luck. Her last words were directed at her crew, the ones who had stayed behind to keep the carrier running long enough to tear through the net. She said, "It has been an honor, and I will see you on the other side." Then the carrier was consumed. 612 people, gone. The 3 destroyers reached the relay node and destroyed it. The entire net formation collapsed, and the surviving swarm organisms scattered. Sophie Brennan had traded her ship and her life for a tactical advantage that would save thousands. The mathematics were simple. The human cost was not. That evening, the remaining fleet held a memorial. It was brief and brutal in its simplicity. The names were read aloud. Every name, every rank, every ship. No speeches, no eulogies, no flags or ceremonies. Just names spoken into silence, each one a weight added to the burden that every Terran carried. When the last name was read, there was a moment of absolute stillness. Then the crew returned to their stations, and resumed preparations for the next engagement. I found Daniel Marsh in a corridor afterward. He was sitting against a bulkhead with his eyes closed, and for the first time since I had met him, he looked fragile. Human. I asked him how they bore it, how they carried the weight of so many dead, and kept moving forward. He opened his eyes, and said something that I have never forgotten. "We do not bear it, Commander. We carry it. There is a difference. Bearing means enduring. Carrying means using the weight to hit harder." 6 days from the galactic core, long-range sensors detected the Queen structure. It was visible on every instrument as a massive biological construct, roughly the size of a small moon, orbiting a dead star in a region of space so dense with swarm matter that the sensors could barely penetrate it. The Queen was the brain of the Vreth, the central node from which all commands flowed. Destroy it, and every Vreth organism in the galaxy would lose coordination simultaneously. They would become mindless, individual creatures, easily contained and eliminated. The problem was reaching it. The concentration of swarm matter around the Queen was the densest anyone had ever recorded. Billions of organisms packed into a sphere of biological tissue, hundreds of thousands of kilometers across. Fighting through it conventionally would take months, and cost more ships than the entire combined fleet possessed. The Concord commanders who had accompanied the fleet declared a direct assault impossible. Admiral Torin, who had traveled with us from the staging area, presented a detailed analysis showing that any approach to the Queen would result in fleet losses exceeding 95% before reaching striking distance. Okoye listened to his analysis and then presented her own plan. The main fleet would engage the outer swarm, drawing its attention and pulling defensive organisms away from the Queen. While the outer battle raged, a volunteer force would breach the Queen structure's outer shell in heavy assault craft, fight their way to the neural core, and destroy it from the inside. It was, by any rational assessment, a suicide mission. The breach team would be operating inside a hostile biological organism with no extraction plan. Even if they succeeded in destroying the core, the probability of survival was near zero. Okoye asked for volunteers. She made the odds clear. She made the likely outcome explicit. She offered no false hope and no comforting words. She simply stated the mission and asked who was willing. Every single Terran in the fleet volunteered. Every pilot, every Marine, every engineer, every medic, every cook and maintenance worker and communications officer, every one. I stood at the back of the briefing room and watched it happen. There was no hesitation, no dramatic speeches. No one stepped forward with tears in their eyes and proclaimed their willingness to die for the cause. They simply raised their hands, one by one, calmly and quietly, as if they had been waiting their entire lives for this moment and had always known it would come. There was no heroism in the gesture, no performance, just hands going up with the same matter-of-fact simplicity with which one might volunteer for a work detail. The contrast between the enormity of what they were agreeing to and the quietness with which they agreed to it was staggering. These were people volunteering to die, and they did it with less drama than a Concord officer requesting shore leave. I looked at their faces and saw no madness, no death wish, no fanatical gleam. I saw ordinary people who had weighed the cost of action against the cost of inaction and made a decision. They were not throwing their lives away. They were investing them. Every Terran in that room understood exactly what the mission required, exactly what the odds were, and exactly what the stakes would be if no one went. And so they went. Okoye selected 200 Marines for the breach team, the best of the best, though in truth, among the Terrans, the difference between the best and the rest was nearly impossible to measure. She appointed a grizzled sergeant named Owen Pratt to lead the ground team and a pilot named Elliot Vance to command the assault craft. That night, I found Okoye alone in her quarters, staring out a viewport at the distant glow of the galactic core. I asked her the question that had been consuming me since I had watched every Terran in the fleet raise their hand. "Why?" I said. "Why did all of them volunteer? They know they will probably die." She turned from the viewport and looked at me, and for the first time since I had met her, I saw something behind those steel-gray eyes that was not strategy or discipline or controlled intensity. It was pain, old pain, the kind that never heals because you will not let it. 400 years ago, she said. Your Concord banned us because of what we did to the Rithek. You called us monsters. You locked us away. And maybe you were right. But here is what none of you understood. We did not enjoy what we did to the Rithek. We hated it. We hated that we were capable of it. That is why we accepted the ban. Not because we were forced to, because we were afraid of ourselves. We looked at what we had done, and we were horrified, and we decided that the galaxy was right to be afraid of us. So we went home. We sealed our ships underground. We turned our aggression inward, toward building and creating and improving, and we waited, hoping that the call would never come. But we prepared, because we knew it would. She paused, and the pain in her eyes deepened into something vast and dark. Right now, this galaxy is about to die. Everything you have built, everything every species has created, every child on every world, all of it is going to be consumed by something that does not even understand what it is destroying, and the only thing standing between extinction and survival is the monster you locked in the basement. So let us be what we are. Let us do what we were made to do. And when it is over, you can lock the door again. We will not fight you. We never have. I stood there in the dim light of her quarters and felt something shift inside me, a tectonic realignment of everything I had believed about Terrans, and about the ban, and about the nature of what it meant to be dangerous. The Terrans were not monsters. They were something far more complex and far more tragic. They were a species that knew exactly what they were capable of, that carried that knowledge like a wound that would never close, and that chose, every single day, to contain the thing inside them that the galaxy feared. Not because they were forced to, because they understood, better than anyone, why it needed to be contained. The monster was not the Terran capacity for destruction. The monster was the fact that they had no choice but to carry it. The final assault began at dawn, by the dead star's fading light. The combined fleet emerged from transit at the edge of the swarm sphere, and for a moment, every sensor on every ship showed the same thing. An ocean of living matter, stretching to the horizon in every direction, pulsing and writhing with a billion separate organisms, all moving with a single terrible purpose. The queen structure was visible at the center, a dark mass against the pale glow of the dying star, and between us and it lay the densest concentration of hostile biological material that had ever existed in the recorded history of the galaxy. Admiral Torren's voice came over the command channel, steady despite the enormity of what he was seeing. All Concord forces, begin outer engagement. Draw the swarm's defensive perimeter outward. Give the Terrans their corridor. The Concord fleet advanced in formation, weapons firing into the outer layers of the swarm. The organisms responded immediately, turning to face the incoming fire, tendrils reaching out to intercept missiles and energy beams. The outer battle was massive, thousands of ships against billions of organisms, and the noise on every communication channel was a wall of overlapping voices, target calls, damage reports, and cries for support. In the middle of the chaos, the Terran fleet began its attack. Okoye had designed the assault in layers, each one feeding into the next like the stages of a predator's hunt. The outermost Terran ships engaged the swarm's defensive perimeter at multiple points simultaneously, forcing it to spread its attention across dozens of fronts. Electronic warfare ships broadcast disruption signals on Vreth neural frequencies, causing localized confusion that created gaps in the swarm's coordination. Heavy bombardment ships targeted relay nodes at extreme range, using the intelligence gathered from every previous engagement to strike with a precision that bordered on prescient. The swarm fought back with everything it had: massive tendrils, each one kilometers long and dense with predatory organisms, swept through the battlefield, crushing ships that could not maneuver fast enough to evade. Clouds of smaller organisms swarmed individual vessels, seeking hull breaches and engine intakes, trying to infiltrate and consume from within. The space between the fleet and the Queen became a maelstrom of fire and biological matter, so dense with combat that sensors could barely distinguish between friendly and hostile contacts. Conquered ships on the outer screen were taking heavy casualties, and Admiral Torren's voice on the command channel grew increasingly strained as he directed reinforcements to collapsing sectors. But the Terrans never wavered. Their coordination held even in the midst of the chaos, each ship moving with that same fluid, instinctive precision I had first witnessed at Tyrell. Where Concord ships fought to survive, the Terran ships fought to advance. Every engagement, every sacrifice, every weapon fired was calculated to create or widen the corridor that the breach team needed. And through the gaps and the confusion, the breach team launched. 20 assault craft, heavily armored and loaded with 200 Marines, dove into the swarm like needles piercing skin. They moved fast, faster than anything I had seen, their pilots threading impossible paths through gaps in the swarm's tissue that existed for seconds before closing. Vreth organisms attacked them from every angle. Tendrils lashed at their hulls, acidic compounds sprayed across their armor. Smaller parasitic organisms attempted to breach their engines and navigation systems. The assault craft fought back with close-range weapons that turned the space around them into a sphere of fire. Marines manned external turrets, exposed to vacuum behind thin shields, pouring fire into the swarm matter that pressed in from every direction. 3 assault craft were lost in the first 10 minutes, crushed by swarm tissue that closed around them like a fist. The remaining 17 pushed forward. I could hear fragments of communication from the assault craft, broken transmissions that came through in bursts of static and clarity. Pilot Elliot Vance commanded from the lead craft, his voice a metronome of calm instruction, even as his ship was being battered from every direction. He called out gap coordinates, adjusted formation on the fly, and managed the approach with the precision of a surgeon operating in an earthquake. When his starboard engine was torn away by a tendril strike, he compensated without comment, adjusting his trajectory with manual thrusters, and losing barely half a second of forward momentum. 2 more assault craft were lost at the halfway point, their signals vanishing from the network in quick succession, there and then not there, like candles blown out by a wind no one could see. The remaining 15 pressed on, closing the distance meter by agonizing meter, each moment purchased with ammunition, armor, and lives. I watched the feeds from the Absolute Authority's tactical bridge, and what I saw defied everything I knew about warfare, survival, and the limits of what living beings could endure. The assault craft were being torn apart piece by piece, losing armor plates and engine pods and weapons arrays, and they kept going. The Marines inside kept fighting, switching to backup systems, rerouting power, sealing breaches with emergency patches, and sometimes with their own bodies. I watched a Marine named Lance Corporal Kira Fenn seal a hull breach by pressing her armored back against it and bracing, while her squad mates continued to fire through the forward gun port. She held that position for 11 minutes, until the craft reached the Queen's outer shell. By then, the breach had burned through her suit's rear plating, and she had third-degree burns across her entire back. She walked off the craft under her own power and picked up a weapon. The Queen's outer shell was a thick layer of hardened biological material, dense enough to resist conventional weapons. Sergeant Pratt's team used shaped charges to blast entry points, and the Marines poured through in teams of 8, moving in the coordinated fluid pattern that I now recognized as the hallmark of Terran ground combat doctrine. Each team covered the others, each individual knew their role without being told, and they advanced through the Queen's interior with a relentless forward momentum that never wavered. The interior was a nightmare given form. Organic corridors pulsed with bioluminescent light, the walls alive with tissue that contracted and expanded like breathing lungs. Defensive organisms, things with too many limbs and mouths full of dissolving compounds, swarmed from recesses in the walls and floors. The gravity shifted unpredictably as the Queen's internal mass distribution changed, throwing Marines into walls and ceilings without warning. The air, pumped in through the assault craft's portable life support systems, was thick with spores that attempted to colonize anything they touched. The Marines fought through all of it. They used weapons, explosives, plasma cutters, and in several documented cases, their bare hands. Sergeant Pratt led from the front, his armor scarred and pitted, his voice on the communication channel, a constant stream of calm instructions. He called out threats, directed fire, and kept his people moving forward with a relentless certainty that anchored the entire team. When a defensive organism the size of a ground transport vehicle burst from the wall directly in front of him, he did not retreat. He dropped to one knee, fired 3 rounds into its central mass, and was moving again before the creature had finished falling. Behind him, Marines fell one by one, each one buying meters of progress with their lives. A corporal named Reggie Shaw held a corridor junction alone for 6 minutes while the main team advanced, his weapon firing until the barrel glowed white, and his ammunition counter read 0. Then he drew a sidearm and held for 2 minutes more. His body was found still facing the direction the enemy had come from. Others sealed corridors with their own bodies so that the organisms behind them could not follow the advancing team. Others detonated personal charges at junction points, collapsing tunnel structures to slow the swarm's internal defense response. Each sacrifice was quiet and deliberate. No screaming, no dramatic last words. Just men and women making a calculation, deciding that the mission was worth more than their individual survival, and acting on that decision without hesitation. Communications from the breach team became sporadic as they moved deeper. The Queen's tissue interfered with transmission signals, and each update arrived fragmented and broken, like a voice calling from underwater. But every update confirmed the same thing: forward progress. Casualties mounting, but forward progress. Outside, the fleet battle reached its peak. The Concord and Terran forces threw everything they had at the swarm, and the swarm threw everything back. Ships were destroyed on both sides. The space around the Queen became a graveyard of twisted metal and dead organic matter, and still the fighting continued, because it had to. Because every second of distraction bought the breach team another meter of progress toward the core. Okoye stood on the bridge of the Resolute Conviction, monitoring every feed, every data stream, every fragment of communication from the breach team. She said nothing. She gave no orders. Her hands were clasped behind her back, and her face was a mask of absolute stillness. But I could see the tension in her shoulders, the way her jaw tightened each time a Marine's signal went dark. She was watching her people die, and she was letting them, because the mission required it, and the mission was everything. The surviving Marines, fewer than 60 out of the original 200, reached the Queen's neural core. Sergeant Pratt's transmission came through fragmentary and broken, but the essential information was clear. They had found it. A vast chamber of pulsing biological matter, the central brain of the entire Vreth network, from which billions of commands flowed outward along neural pathways that spanned the galaxy. The core was alive in a way that transcended biology, a nexus of consciousness so vast and complex that even the battle-hardened Marines paused at the threshold. Pratt reported that the core was broadcasting, not tactical commands, not defensive instructions, raw emotional signals, fear, pain, something that might have been grief. The Queen, the heart of the swarm that had consumed worlds and killed billions, was afraid. It knew what was coming. It could feel the Marines at its door, and it was terrified. The signals washed over the Marines in waves, pressing against their minds with an intensity that made several of them stagger. The Queen was trying to communicate, trying to find some frequency of meaning that might bridge the gap between its consciousness and theirs. One Marine later described it as the feeling of standing in a room with a trapped animal, something enormous and powerful and utterly desperate, broadcasting its terror with every fiber of its being. Another said it felt like drowning in someone else's nightmare. For a moment, the communication channel went silent. 60 Marines stood at the edge of an alien consciousness that was crying out in fear, and for one long, heavy moment, the weight of what they were about to do pressed down on all of them. These were not cruel people. They did not enjoy destruction. They understood, perhaps better than any other species could, the magnitude of ending a consciousness, however alien, however hostile. They felt the weight of it. They carried it. Then Pratt's voice came through, steady and clear. "It is afraid," he said. "Good." So were the 30 billion people it already ate. They planted the charges. The work was methodical, thorough, and systematic. Classic Terran doctrine, applied to a target of incomprehensible scale. Every charge placed at a structural junction point. Every detonation sequence timed to create a cascading failure that would propagate through the entire neural network. They were not just killing the Queen. They were ensuring that nothing like it could ever reassemble from the remains. The detonation command was given by Sergeant Pratt. His last transmission was 2 words: fire in the hole. The Queen structure detonated from within. The explosion was not nuclear or thermal. It was biological. A cascading neural collapse that spread outward from the core at the speed of thought, shutting down every connection, severing every command pathway, silencing every signal. The effect was instantaneous and absolute. Across the galaxy, every Vreth swarm cluster went inert simultaneously. Billions of organisms, in hundreds of systems, on dozens of worlds, stopped moving at the same moment. They did not die immediately. They simply ceased to function as a coordinated entity. They became what they had always been beneath the Queen's command. Individual organisms, with no purpose, no direction, and no will. The silence on every communication channel lasted for 10 seconds. 10 seconds of absolute, crystalline silence, in which the entire galaxy held its breath. Then the Concorde ships began broadcasting victory signals, and the silence shattered into 1,000 voices all speaking at once. Cheering, weeping, praying, screaming with relief and exhaustion, and a joy so intense it bordered on madness. 400 years of fear and 18 months of war ended in a single moment of silence, followed by an eruption of raw, uncontrollable emotion. On the Terran ships, there was no cheering. There was only the reading of names. It started on Okoye's ship, a single voice speaking a single name into the communication channel. Then another voice. Then another. Ship by ship, crew by crew, the Terran fleet began to recite the names of every person they had lost since the war began. Every pilot, every Marine, every engineer and medic and crew member who had given their life to reach this moment. The list took over an hour. When it was done, there was silence again, and then the Terran fleet began the long process of recovering what was left of the breach team. They found 19 survivors inside the Queen's shattered remains. 19 out of 200. Sergeant Pratt was not among them. Pilot Elliot Vance was found alive in the wreckage of his assault craft, both legs broken, still gripping the flight controls. He asked about the mission before he asked about his injuries. When they told him the Queen was dead, he closed his eyes and said nothing for a long time. Then he asked for the casualty count. When they told him, he nodded once and said, "Get me to the med bay. There is work to do." Kira Fenn, the lance corporal who had sealed the hull breach with her body, was among the survivors. She was carried out on a stretcher with burns covering 40% of her body and a broken arm she had not reported during the entire operation. She was conscious, and when a medic told her she was going home, she said, "I know. But they are not." She was looking at the body bags being loaded onto the recovery shuttle beside her. Each one carried a friend. I returned to the Galactic Concorde for the post-war session 4 days later. The council chambers were packed with representatives from every member species, and the atmosphere was divided in a way I had never seen before. Half the chamber wanted to honor the Terrans as the saviors of the galaxy. Statues, memorials, a permanent seat on the council, full integration into the Concorde's military structure. The other half wanted to reinstate the Terran Exclusion Accord immediately, their voices tight with the same fear I had heard in the corridor after the Battle of Tyrell. What we had witnessed was not reassuring. It was terrifying. The Terrans had saved the galaxy, yes, but they had done it with a capability so overwhelming, so total, and so ruthlessly effective that every species in the chamber was now asking the same question. What happens when the Terrans decide they do not want to be allies anymore? The debate raged for hours. Species that had united against the Vreth now fractured along lines of fear and gratitude. The Dromon wanted alliance. The Kelzari wanted distance. The Silkari, as always, counseled patience. Vorethi sat in her ancient seat and watched the proceedings with all 4 eyes open, and I could not tell whether her expression was satisfaction or sorrow. She had tried to warn us. She had been right about everything, but I no longer believed that being right was the same as being wise. I sat in my designated seat and listened and said nothing, because I did not yet know what I believed. Then the holographic display in the center of the chamber activated without authorization, and Lena Okoye's face appeared. She had not been invited. She had not requested permission to address the council. She simply appeared, and the chamber went silent, with the kind of quiet that falls when something undeniable demands attention. She spoke for less than 3 minutes. "You banned us because you were afraid of what we could do," she said. "That was wise. We accepted the ban because we were afraid of the same thing. Today we did what you needed us to do and we will live with what that cost for the rest of our lives. Every species in this chamber sleeps peacefully because someone else stayed awake in the dark. That is what Terrans do. We sit in the dark so others do not have to know it exists." She paused, and in the silence, I saw her eyes, and for just a moment, I saw behind the steel and the discipline and the controlled precision. I saw exhaustion, grief, the accumulated weight of every name on that list, every life spent to reach this victory, every Marine who walked into a nightmare and did not walk out. "You do not have to thank us," she said. "You do not have to honor us. Just remember, the next time you look at a human and see something that frightens you, we are frightened too. The difference is, we do not look away." She cut the transmission. The display went dark. The chamber remained silent for a very long time. 3 days later, the Terran fleet completed its withdrawal from Concord space. The ships returned to Earth and descended into the underground facilities from which they had emerged. The launch bays sealed. The orbital stations went dark. The ocean-based shipyards submerged and disappeared beneath the waves. Within a week, Earth's military presence had vanished from every sensor array in the galaxy, as if it had never existed. They locked themselves away. No one asked them to. No council voted on it. No accord was drafted or signed. The Terrans simply looked at what they had done, at the power they had unleashed and the cost it had demanded, and they made the same choice they had made 400 years ago. They put themselves back in the cage. The council debated for weeks about whether to reinstate the ban. In the end, they asked me for my recommendation, because I was the only non-Terran who had witnessed the full scope of what had happened, from the underground facilities to the Queen's neural core. I wrote my report carefully. I chose every word with the precision that the moment demanded. And my recommendation was this: do not reinstate the ban. There is no need. The Terrans have already banned themselves, and they will enforce that ban more strictly than any external authority ever could. Because the most terrifying thing about humanity is not what they are capable of doing. It is that they know what they are capable of, and they choose, every single day, to carry that knowledge in silence. They do not need a cage built by others. They have always built their own. The Council accepted my recommendation by a narrow margin. The Terran Exclusion Accord was officially dissolved, replaced by a mutual defense treaty that the Terrans signed, but that everyone understood would never be invoked except in the most extreme circumstances. The galaxy would go about its business. The Terrans would go about theirs. And somewhere in the back of every species' collective mind, there would be the knowledge that the most dangerous force in the galaxy was also the most restrained, not because it was forced to be, but because it chose to be. I filed my report and stood at the viewport of the absolute authority, looking out at the stars. The galaxy was quiet, shipping lanes were reopening, colony worlds were rebuilding, life was returning to the rhythms that had existed before the Vreth, and in a generation, most species would remember the war as a historical event, distant and abstract, something that happened to other people in other places. But I would remember. I would remember the underground caverns filled with sleeping warships. I would remember Catherine Hale's hollow eyes and the grief she scheduled for later. I would remember Daniel Marsh explaining why they named their ships after disasters. I would remember Sophie Brennan's calm voice as her carrier was consumed. I would remember Sergeant Owen Pratt's last 2 words, spoken with the steady clarity of a man who had made peace with what he was about to do. I would remember Marcus Wells finishing a joke 4 hours after an alarm interrupted it. Because humor was how Terrans reminded themselves that they were still alive. I would remember Kira Fenn's burned back and her quiet words about the friends who would not be going home. I would remember Reggie Shaw's empty weapon and his body still facing the enemy. And I would remember Elliot Vance, both legs shattered, asking about the mission before he asked about the pain. And I would remember Lena Okoye, standing in the dim light of her quarters, telling me the truth that the galaxy had never wanted to hear, that the Terrans were not monsters, that they were something far more extraordinary. A species that looked into the darkest part of themselves, saw what lived there, and instead of denying it or celebrating it, chose to carry it in silence, bearing the weight so that others would never have to. The galaxy is quiet tonight. Somewhere, on a small blue world orbiting a modest yellow star, the most dangerous species in existence is putting itself back in the cage. Not because anyone ordered it, not because any law demands it, but because they understand, in a way that no other species ever has, that the greatest strength is not the power to destroy. It is the power to choose not to. That is why they were banned. That is why they accepted it. And that, more than the ships, more than the weapons, more than the impossible things they did inside a living nightmare at the heart of the galaxy, is why they are the most extraordinary species I have ever known.